So this is my response to WoodenPotatoes' video comparing Guild Wars 1 and WoW Classic. And obviously it's pretty hard to compare these two games because WoW Classic's current player base is very thriving because it just got released, and Guild Wars 1's player base is sort of, it's in another game. It's in Guild Wars 2, right? So it's a little bit weird to compare the two when an MMO is very player base dependent. So I think the context which WoodenPotatoes tried to ignore is a little bit more important than it was made apparent in the video. But obviously the game themselves are it's very possible to review them without the player base, right? And I think that some of the big themes of these two games being compared is that immersion is not necessarily what you want in a game. So Guild Wars 1 was very it was very immersive, but not as immersive as WoW. However, Guild Wars 1 was much better of a game. Now, when these games first came out, I originally played Guild Wars 1 at my friend's house, and I was really immersed in the world of pre-searing, so much so that I stayed up all night and got beyond the searing. I got into I got past the tutorial, which was about like 8 levels into the game. My first experience of WoW was very vivid as well. I remember leveling in Teldrassil on my Night Elf Rogue, and I was actually playing Guild Wars 1 at the time, doing Heroes Ascent, and waiting for pug groups to get into the game, and I would just level in WoW while I was doing that. And there's that kind of aspect of WoW that's interesting, where you can level by yourself, which WoodenPotatoes mentions. A lot of it is solo, but some of it does require your team, right? But a lot of it is possible to do solo, and then you have the option to do it in a team. Whereas in Guild Wars, everything requires a team. You can't really do anything solo, and I think it's pretty interesting to look at the pre-searing experience, which to a lot of people, they really enjoyed that because it's so low investment and it's just kind of like free roam. And then the rest of Guild Wars 1 is just a long dungeon because you're constantly doing this teamwork thing. And I think that that's something that both games have an issue with, right? Because later on in Guild Wars 1 development, it becomes a sort of single player game with heroes and henchmen, and then in World of Warcraft it becomes more of I need a guild to raid, right? So the leveling experience for Guild Wars is kind of like, oh, this is way too high investment, and the leveling experience in WoW is like, oh, this is pretty nice, I don't need, it's very low investment. And then the end game of Guild Wars 1 is you're kind of like ready for teamwork, and the end game of WoW it's a little bit different. So I feel like Guild Wars 1 has a very much more efficient leveling system to get you ready for the end game, whereas WoW just has a really long leveling system, so you're given more opportunities to learn how to get through the game, right? But you're not necessarily given that opportunity. It's just the potential to. So I think that the leveling in WoW isn't so good at teaching you what the end game is really about, which is it's sort of like large scale PvE raids. And you could argue that the end game of WoW isn't actually about raids. It's more about the conflict between the Alliance and the Horde, and just going into raids is your reason to get more gear so that when you do have to fight with the Horde or the Alliance, depending on which you are, you'll be able to win that resource, right? And So I want to look at the player base because that's sort of the whole purpose of the game, right? Even if Guild Wars 1 is really a cooperative online RPG, it's still about the player base. So back in the launch of both of these games in like 2005, gaming was starting to become popular, but now gaming is very widespread, and there's a huge difference in how the priorities of the gamers of today exist, right? Because the gamers of back then are now grown up, and the newcomers into the gaming industry have their different priorities. So there's a wide gap in how people play games now, and this is shown in WoW Classic very much so, with how people have adopted a new strategy for doing battlegrounds where they just rush to the end to get the reward rather than engage in some sort of strategic way to prevent the enemy team from winning more often than they themselves win, right? It's more of that kind of immersive thing that they used to do back in the day, whereas today there's a pullback from the immersion and more into the, well, what are the game's mechanics, right? And I feel like Guild Wars 1 suited that kind of playstyle better because it was a better game, not so much a better world. Whereas WoW is very much an immersive world. It has all these inconveniences that kind of add up to make you feel like you're in a world, not in a game, right? Whereas in Guild Wars 1, there are some very hard drawbacks that tell you, oh, this is a game, such as fast travel, not being able to interact with the world as much as in WoW. There's so much more verticality in WoW. So I would say that for a teenager back in the day who was looking for an escape from their schoolwork or their social awkwardness, WoW was a really good game. But today I feel like it's probably not that good. It's more of it's definitely a game for people who want to invest a lot of time into it. Guild Wars 1 definitely better for less time investment if you want to just play it as a game, not as a lifestyle, right? So I want to get into what the purpose of each game is. So Guild Wars 1, as WoodenPotatoes mentions, is definitely about getting people ready for endgame PvP, right? With the tutorials all being about helping your allies, and even the pre-searing end event includes a PvP match. So I definitely agree with PvP being the, or at least cooperative gameplay being the purpose of Guild Wars 1. But WoW, I'm not really so sure that raiding is necessarily the purpose, right? It's kind of like this role-playing thing where there is no purpose to old WoW. It was just because there was no story, right? There was a story that drove Guild Wars 1, and there's no real story that drove WoW. It was kind of just like, well, just do whatever you want. The gear grind was completely optional, whereas in Guild Wars 1, you kind of needed to progress the story to get through the game and explore as much as possible. So the purpose of Guild Wars 1 was also kind of like to complete the story, which for WoW, the story is the eternal conflict between the Horde and the Alliance. And I think that this story is actually pretty good too in WoW, because as a new player, you learn very fast that the enemy is the opposing faction who will try to stop you from achieving levels and compete for quest credit, and you'll even be ganked by the opposing faction just because they can't. And the story becomes more of a personal thing in WoW, whereas the story in Guild Wars 1 is sort of like this detached thing of like a whole world. So it's kind of weird because I think that both games have these really good approaches to all of these topics, and they both have pluses and minuses in the same area, right? Because WoW has this really nice lore and this nice immersion, but then it's all kind of, well, there's no purpose to it. And then in Guild Wars 1, it's, I have this strong direction in the game, but there's no me in it, really, other than I'm a character that's being driven by these other characters. A lot of the quest lines in WoW are very optional, whereas in Guild Wars 1, you need to go very far out of your way to avoid the main quest line. The story of WoW is made by the players, whereas the story of Guild Wars 1 is made by the developers. So I would definitely hand it to WoW that it has better immersion, and that's really important. However, I think that there are some things that were mentioned in the video that I'm responding to that weren't exactly correct about why WoW is more immersive. I would say that the reason why WoW is more immersive is because of the convenience of the game. It's not convenient, right? One thing that was mentioned was the issue of separate maps. So Guild Wars has these load screens between the maps, but to me that feels like a non-issue, because in WoW it kind of is worse, because even though there's no load screen between the maps, there are these very wide distinctions between each map. So if I go from the Barrens into Ashenvale, it's a completely different zone, and it feels almost like there's no transition. And you can also see this very vividly with, there's a kind of like a fog in the air, and you'll see in the Barren there's like a very stark yellow fog, and then as soon as you go into Ashenvale it's a dreamy purple, and then you'll go into Felwood, and these are three zones that are adjacent to each other, and Felwood has this very green corrupted look, and it just feels like each zone is a box, and it almost feels like a theme park kind of experience, where the perimeters of these maps change drastically the landscape, and they don't really serve as a load screen, but as a way of sorting these biomes into their shapes on the map, rather than creating a whole picture. Guild Wars was much less strict on the separation of these biomes. Multiple maps, even though they had load screens, they would all take place in a biome. So the Fire Islands would have a couple maps, and it would make sense when you'd get to them. There'd be no like, oh, we're in the Fire Islands now. No, you have to take a boat to the Fire Islands, and obviously fast travel is an issue here. But if you look at the Shiver Peaks, you travel through the Shiver Peaks during the beginning of the story, and then you later come through in the southern Shiver Peaks, and it makes them feel like an actual place in the world. So the Guild Wars world felt more realistic, whereas the world as a whole in WoW feels more like a theme park of biomes you travel to. And of course the gameplay didn't play this linearly in WoW. You were often going back and forth between the zones and doing quests, but in Guild Wars you generally followed a certain path and only went off the main path to do extra quests before continuing onward. So in a way, WoW had better mechanics for the immersion, but Guild Wars just had a better world to get immersed in. And I feel that this is once again showing that it's really hard to compare the two games, because they're both really good in all of these areas, but they're also really hard setbacks that one has that the other doesn't, and it's difficult. One thing that I did find really interesting was that the Guild Wars level cap is reached much earlier than a player reaches the end game, and gear is capped at that level. But in WoW, the raids and PvP ranks create sort of a gear treadmill, and as he mentions in his video, WoodenPotatoes says that when you go back to those maps, there's really this power creep where you don't really feel a threat anymore. And I've experienced this because if I go back to a map that I'm 30 levels above, all the mobs I can just one-shot. And that's sort of deletes any sort of semblance of gameplay to any of the quests or story that you want to play through that you might have missed through the first time. Now, obviously, you can create another toon and go through those zones, but in Guild Wars 1, much of the PvE game is around the same level as each other, and especially because it's balanced around teamwork, you can't just flop your way through and get it done. You have to get better at the game in a way to improve your team. So while you are not really getting stronger as a character, the game is getting stronger. So you have to adapt to learning how the game works and kind of increasing your palette of skills to adapt to each situation as well. So you had to become more skillful at the game, whereas in WoW, a lot of your challenges you overcome, you just say, well, I'm not high enough level to go here yet, so I'll come back later. And in that way, Guild Wars 1 was way more immersive, because in WoW, you didn't really need to... There are situations where you had to problem solve to get through it, but it wasn't really necessary, because you could just get better gear or get better, get more friends, really. But Guild Wars 1 was very... The instanced nature of all of the content prevented you from zerging things down, because it was all balanced towards that player amount. Now, obviously, I'd still give WoW the better hand in immersion, because fast travel exists in Guild Wars 1. And while that convenience makes it a better game, it really does make it feel like, as WoodenPotatoes mentions, like there's no threat to any part of the story, right? You just get to the desert and then it's like, oh, I can go back. You're not stranded there. You can go back at any time, and it sort of detracts from the story in a way. So in WoW, you take like 20 minutes to take a flight path from one side of the continent to the other, and there's different ways to travel, and you have to kind of be creative in your path, because there are a lot of factors. One topic that I thought was very important to not just this comparison, but to all games, is the meaningfulness of death. Now, there have been a lot of games that make death very meaningful, like in Divinity Original Sin 2, there is the tactician mode, or is the honor mode, where if you die, your game mode gets deleted. Now, I'm not saying that games should be that strict on the meaningfulness of death, but it is pretty important to compare that, whereas, the permadeath mode is as close to reality as possible, and then you have modern games now where you die and you get sent back to a checkpoint that was like 30 seconds ago, and it's like, well, yeah, you're kind of learning, but your death isn't very meaningful at all. You may as well just be invulnerable, and you just go through the game, and you can't beat it until you learn the mechanics, but you never really die. So How WoW handles death is when you die, you become a spirit, and then you have to run back to your body and then revive. So this makes it very difficult for you to forget how you died, right? So, I got killed by this rogue, and then I'm running back to my corpse. I'm going to be like, well, he might still be there and he might gank me. And it kind of adds this continuation to the story, right? In Guild Wars, you had resurrection shrines and death penalty, which is whenever you die, you lose 15% of your max energy and health, and it kind of snowballs on you, right? So the more you die, the more likely you are to die, and if you die too much, you're going to be unable to complete the content. And even some missions, if your whole party dies, then you get kicked out. So in WoW, raids are not as meaningful as that, because when you die, you just run back in, and then the boss is still waiting for you. If you kill a boss, that boss is dead for the rest of the week, right? Because there's a lockout and loot. Whereas in Guild Wars, there's no real loot to the bosses, right? The loot is more about rare drops and crafting. So the progression was just completing the instance, not completing a boss or finding a checkpoint. So in WoW, I feel like it has that newer, in WoW Classic that is, it has that newer kind of checkpoint feel where you kill a boss. That's a really good feeling because now you got a checkpoint. In Guild Wars 1, every mission, even just like a story mission, it had this tension in it. And the checkpoint was completing the mission, right? So it felt a lot more punishing to play Guild Wars when you were just starting the game and you didn't know what you were doing. It definitely had a tougher learning curve. Whereas in WoW, you still do have a punishing effect for dying, right? Because it takes time. And there's also respawns in dungeons and raids. So if you take too long to kill a boss and there's respawns, well, then you've got to clear that again, and obviously you don't have unlimited time. You've only got a raid there of 40 people to, raid for 3 hours, so you're not going to complete all the content if you're taking too long. So there is definitely a punishment to death in WoW, for sure. And obviously there's your gear getting broken, which gives you a repair bill, which I think adds a lot to the immersion because you have to go out and farm or gather or craft or do something to get some kind of income. So it's like you have a job in the game, and then once you've done your job, whatever your way of getting money, and then you bring that to your raid, right, where you use your consumables and all that, and it does feel very immersive in that way. But in Guild Wars 1, obviously, the immersion comes from the whole performance, right? There's no the preparation is there, right, with the build crafting and all, but it's not like, oh, I have to go out and create an economy to do so. So they both have their immersion in death, but in different ways, and it's kind of coming up to be like these pluses and minuses again. Like each one has really good aspects to its immersion, but once again, WoW's immersion comes from the economy and the lifestyle, whereas Guild Wars is all about performance and the game, the mechanics. So once again, it's coming back to Guild Wars is a game and WoW is kind of like a world. And that's why I like the kind of the analogy that WoodenPotatoes made of Guild Wars 1's whole world kind of being like an extended dungeon. So if we look at WoW, they have the open world, and then they have dungeons and raids, but all of Guild Wars is kind of like instance, right? So it is like an open world dungeon. And that makes every experience in the game feel more urgent and therefore more immersive by making it more emotional feeling of that urgency. Whereas WoW gets its immersion sort of more naturally. So while I would give it to WoW and agree that it has a better world and it's much better at immersing its players, I think Guild Wars 1 very much got close, but in a different way. And of course, the most important part of game is what are its mechanics like? What is it actually like to play the game? And Guild Wars was by far the better game in that aspect. The whole class system was very, very developed, and it felt, even today, like a very developed game. Back then, WoW Classic may have been good, but today, WoW Classic is not very good. The class system is very simplistic, and it's very unbalanced, and it's very clunky. Now, there are some things that you have to learn, like how to jump while casting skills, so you can get the most out of your movement, and knowing when to precast spells. But in general, a good player can still feel like they'll just die to an 8-second stun or a warlock casting 1 dot on them and it doing like all of their life. So WoW's gameplay is definitely a lot worse. But one thing it does have very, very good is class identity. And it's kind of hard to compare class identity in WoW Classic to Guild Wars because Guild Wars purposefully muddied its class identity with the dual class system. So as an elementalist, you gained a primary attribute of energy storage, and you could use energy storage to maybe do a secondary class like necromancer, and you could do like massive necromancer combos because you're allowed so much more energy as an elementalist that you couldn't do as a necromancer because they have more sustained energy gain and not so much of a burst at the start of the fight energy. So yeah, Guild Wars 1 definitely had less class identity, but that kind of just fits more into that whole theme I've just been talking about, where WoW is a better world and Guild Wars is the better game, right? Because you have all of this, all these options for build crafting and adapting to the encounters because of the dual class system. But WoW is more like, well, I'm a mage, this is my role, this is what I do. I give people food, I give people portals, I do fiery effects, I do icy effects, and that's who I am, you know. And I am a rogue, I am stealth, right? Like there's no other well, yeah, there's a lot of other class mechanics, right? But that's the main class mechanic of rogue is stealth. So in Guild Wars 1, the main class mechanic is sort of like that primary attribute, and you sort of wanted to use that in every case, but there were still cases where you didn't, right? So the class identity was a little bit more muddied, well, a lot more muddied than WoW Classic. But is that really a bad thing or a good thing? I think it's just about immersion versus game mechanics, right? And I don't need to really say this anymore, right? But it is that. So another thing about the game's mechanics is more about the customizability of the game. So Guild Wars 1 had a customizable UI, but WoW had add-ons and macros, So while I do like that Guild Wars 1's customizability was sort of in game, so there wasn't like an unfair advantage you had for being able to, use a third party software. I did like that WoW used macros. Now, macros are sort of weird because they sort of do feel like add-ons or something that it's not really intuitive what it is, because there's kind of like this coding language to it, right? But once you kind of learn how macros work, there's a lot of creative things that you can do to personalize your character too, right? So say you want to do a macro that whenever you get on your mount, you're going to put on your trinket that's going to make your mount faster, right? So you could macro your trinket to your mount. You could macro emotes as well. So like instead of typing out emotes, you could macro an emote so that it would type out the emote by just pressing a key, right? And you could sort of like make a skill bar that was just full of emotes, right? And so like you could macro whenever you change your skill bar to the emote, you could change all of your gear to your like RP gear set, and then you'd be emoting, and it'd be very cool because like say I don't know, for example, you could have like some sort of like Star Wars kind of like cosplay thing, and then you could swap to Star Wars, and then have like a macro where you say Luke, I am your father, and then have like this emote where you press like threaten or something like that. And it's once again to say that there's as WoodenPotatoes mentioned, there's a lot more role play in WoW. Like when you say something with an exclamation mark, your character lifts their hands in the air to show that you're saying something that's intense. Or when you use a question mark, you do sort of like a pondering kind of emote. So the customizability is really the thing that we're talking about here. But in a way, the customizability of WoW allows you more of your character development, whereas the customizability of Guild Wars was about the gameplay, right? It's once again this theme, right? Guild Wars was about the game. WoW is about your character, about the immersion. So it's just pretty clear what the purposes and the audience of these two games are. Now, this has probably gone on for too long, and I have to deal with having a cough, so I'm trying to edit out my coughs here and there. But yeah, I think that the main point is that WoW probably is better, as WP said, because it has that whole history. I think he made a comparison of WoW is like Guild Wars 2 to compare Guild Wars 1 to Warcraft 3, right? So WoW already has all of its backstory set up in Warcraft 3, whereas Guild Wars 1 is the first game that its story is being presented in, right? So there's not really that much for them to draw on in comparison to WoW, where they have this whole world already built. So the backstory of Guild Wars 1 is really just the fall of War and the Guild Wars, whereas WoW Classic has the Sundering, it has all of this Night Elf lore, it has the meeting of the Taurens with the Orcs, it has the fall of Lordaeron, it has all of this lore already in the game. So they don't really need a driving story, so it allows that kind of worldly feel to it. So yeah, I think that both of the games are actually a lot more comparable in terms of how they approach these topics of immersion, whereas one may be better in this way, but the other is better in that way. And one thing is to be very clear about. I think that while WoW is more of an MMO than Guild Wars 1, if we compare Guild Wars 1 to retail WoW or current WoW and Guild Wars 2, Guild Wars 1 is way better of an MMO than even those, because when I think about it, Guild Wars 1, maybe nowadays, it has a lot of hero and, there's a lot of automation to it. But back in the day, it was very much revolved around cooperation. So that whole cooperative aspect of, looking to find a monk, or this mission requires this many people, that was very MMO oriented and very community driven. And I feel like that aspect is something that was missing in WoW Classic a little bit until you got into the end game. There's this stark contrast between your leveling experience in WoW and your end game in WoW. The end game is just, now I'm just farming this. Now I'm just farming this. Just doing raids. Now I'm farming this. And I think that Guild Wars 1 definitely had that richness of gameplay all throughout, where you feel like you're getting ready for something at the end, and then the end is sort of fulfilling with that. When they came out with the elite missions eventually, and just the PvP system in general. I guess that's the final topic, right, is PvP in the two games, right? So obviously the balance is a lot different in the two games, and Guild Wars 1 had better balance for sure. But what about the game modes? So the game modes of PvP in Guild Wars 1 were varied. You had random arenas, you had team arenas, you had Heroes Ascent, you had GVG, and then you had like lower level arenas where you'd basically do random arenas. So there were a lot of different game modes on release. Now, if we look at WoW Classic, they have Battlegrounds and Open World PvP, which I think is actually better than Guild Wars 1, because you have people who want to go in and do PvP against other people who intend to do PvP, just like in Guild Wars 1. But then you also have open world PvP, which is like that randomness, right? Where you don't expect someone to be here, but because they're here now, it kind of creates this story that you don't expect, right? And that's more along the lines of an immersive PvP. Whereas Guild Wars 1 was, it had an immersive PvP because it was so high intensity, and it was very interactive, as opposed to WoW, where it's like kind of like a rock, paper, scissors kind of feel to it. But even then, because of the fact that WoW's open world PvP was it had so many variables to it, it was so much more interesting, even though it was kind of like not so much skill based. So I think that that's something that a lot of the newer games could learn from, right? So Guild Wars 2, it has a World v World now, but even then, it doesn't feel like it's like this random effect where, this person is just randomly here. What kind of story comes out of that? And in retail WoW, PvP is all about arenas. They don't really promote open world PvP that much anymore. So I think that that's really missing from MMOs, is the open world PvP. And WoW Classic really got that down very well, because you have to fight over those resources. In Guild Wars 1, you definitely have better PvP, but it's not immersive. And that's just kind of like what I've been saying this whole time. WoW Classic is the better world, and Guild Wars 1 was the better game.